and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. I am a senior associate at LSE IDEAS. Today, I'm tuning in from one of our partners, the Ratsu Forum in Romania. Welcome to the 40th installment of our LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine dialogue series, initiated in the aftermath of the February 2022 escalation of the war. This series is made possible through partial funding from PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, dedicated to providing research and tracking data on conflict and its resolution. This month marks the 10th anniversary of the Russo-Ukraine war and the 2-year anniversary of the February escalation. As such, we convene today amidst a backdrop of heightened tensions and shifting geopolitical currents to explore the theme of battlefield dynamics and prospects for 2024. Now, in a recent statement, Putin asserted that Ukrainian statehood may suffer an irreparable, very serious blow, quote unquote, if the current battlefield situation persists. The dictator's ominous warning echoed through the corridors of power, underscoring the precarious state of Ukrainian sovereignty in the face of ongoing war. Now, as we gather here, the situation remains fluid, with the ebb and flow of military engagements shaping the destiny of not only Ukraine, but also the global order. For 2024, Ukraine allocated $40 billion for defense and homeland security, which represents approximately 22% of the country's GDP. Now, given that Ukraine is completely outspent by Russia, Western support for Ukraine has served as a critical lifeline. According to the Institute of the Study of War, since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the EU and its member states have made available $148.5 billion to Ukraine. Now, that amount includes the recently announced EU support package of $54 billion. Still, a large percentage of the EU support goes towards non-military spending. Of the $148.5 billion in assistance, only $75 billion was directly allocated to Ukraine for humanitarian, financial, and military support, and another $38 million in security assistance-related funding spent largely in the United States. Now, for the past 2 years, the United States has contributed $45 billion, amounting to approximately half of Ukraine's foreign military assistance. Meanwhile, the US Senate has taken steps to advance the bill to allocate a military aid package of $61 billion to Ukraine. At present, it remains entangled in the web of partisan politics, awaiting resolution in the House of Representatives. Now, this delay is not merely bureaucratic wrangling. It has tangible implications for the war's trajectory. As Russian strikes continue to exact a toll on Ukrainian infrastructure and civilian lives, the urgency of Russian strikes continue to exact a toll on Ukrainian infrastructure. The urgency of bolstering Ukraine defense grows ever more pressing. Now, some military experts have warned that Ukrainians are outgunned 5-1 on the battlefield. As we speak, speculation is building that Russia could soon capture Avdiivka, which will improve Russia's logistical capabilities in Donbass. Yet, even if the $61 billion military aid package will be green-lighted by the US Congress, it is clear that Ukraine will continue to be significantly outspent by the Russians. At the end of last year, Putin approved a record budget increase of approximately 30% for military spending in 2024. This staggering allocation, totaling approximately $415 billion, underscores the Kremlin's unwavering commitment to its military endeavors. To put that into perspective, the budget is nearly 10 times that of Ukraine. The implications of Russia's budgetary surge are profound, and Putin sends a clear message of intent. While Russia's military budget is surging in order to satiate Putin's imperialistic appetite, it seems to me at least that the West is content on handing out hot dogs to Ukrainians at the gates of the gulags, rather than supporting the country to defeat an invading genocidal adversary. But perhaps I'm wrong. Today, our esteemed panelists stand ready to navigate the complexities of battlefield dynamics. With a focus on precision and depth, they will dissect the military equilibrium and analyzed the intricate dance of air, land, and sea power. From the front lines of confrontation in Avdiivka to the strategic chessboard of the Black Sea and Crimea, our discussion will shed light on the evolving contours of the Russia-Ukraine war. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. He has had a stellar career in the US military for nearly 4 decades, including serving as Commanding General of US Army Europe. At present, he also serves as NATO Senior Mentor for Logistics, and he recently co-authored a book, Future War and the Defense of Europe. Welcome. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Keir Giles. He is Senior Consulting Fellow with the Russia and Eurasia Program of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House in London. He's also the Director of Conflict Studies Research Center. His latest book is called Russia's War on Everybody. Welcome, Keir. I'm going to turn first to General Ben Hodges. Ben, welcome again. It's really great to have you on this panel. How would you characterize the current phase of the war? Is it a quote-unquote stalemate? And assuming no unforeseen introduction of equipment on either side, what can be anticipated in the next 12 months? Thank you, Ben.
So first of all, I think it's important to put in context where we are after 10 years of war. Russia invaded 2014, and since then they've had every single advantage. And after 10 years, they still only control 18% of Ukraine. They've lost 500,000 soldiers killed and wounded in thousands of their armored vehicles and artillery pieces. The great Russian Air Force still has failed to achieve air superiority over Ukraine. That's job one for any Air Force. They've also failed to interdict the lines of communication that bring ammunition and weapons from Poland into Ukraine. Not one train or convoy has been destroyed. That's an incredible failure by the Russian Air Force. And the Great Black Sea Fleet, which has a really cool name, is really not that good. They've had to withdraw in part from Sevastopol because of Ukraine's ability with special forces, drones, air and maritime drones, and of course 3 Storm Shadows provided by UK, which destroyed the dry dock in Sevastopol as well as the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. So all in all, I would say that Russia is in a lot of trouble here. Now, I will defer to Keir, who is much more expert on what goes on inside Russia than I am, but my sense, you'd have a hard time filling up a school bus with a number of Russians who actually would want to be in the military fighting against Ukraine. They absolutely don't want to do it. What I don't know is how much more the population is going to absorb. Now, they have a pretty low expectation, I think, for most people outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg anyway. But I think there's vulnerabilities that we should be exploiting over the coming year. And, you tossed out a lot of big economic numbers, but 30% or 40% of Russia's economy, that's not like 30% of UK's economy or 30% of the American economy. In fact, I had Germans tell me over and over and over 2 years ago before the large-scale invasion, they said, come on, Ben, there's no way Russia's going to attack Ukraine. They would be screwing themselves because they would lose their gas customers. And also, by the way, their economy is only the size of Italy. If that's true, then, okay, these percentage increases, what's the real big significance of that? They still have to get artillery ammunition from North Korea. Let me pause there. But I think that there is too much negativity out there. This year is a year of industrial competition. Ukrainians have got to fix their personnel system, and the new commander has got to stabilize the front to buy time to do those things.
Thank you, Ben. And we're definitely going to drill down onto some of the specifics on those comments that you made. Keir, if you would like to maybe jump in here also, and Ben has given you an opening also to add your 2 cents there. But I'd also like to ask you, who is prevailing in the information war amidst the Russia-Ukraine war, and in which information ecosystem? Because there are obviously different information environments out there. And I think this question is particularly interesting also given the recent Tucker Carlson interview So I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Leon. I don't think anybody's in any doubt how important information aspects of this conflict are, both in terms of bolstering support internationally for each of the two opposing sides, and also, of course, for dealing with their own populations. Ben just talked about how the war looks to ordinary Russians, so it's vitally important for Russia to manage its own information environment, for instance. But the key to the question is in that second part that you mentioned, within which information ecosystem is anybody having advantage or disadvantage? Because there are so many different contained environments in which different narratives are playing out. It's inside Ukraine, it's inside Russia, it's across the West with all of the subdivisions there, it's in the rest of the world. But in each of those sectors, there was an early pattern set for who was achieving success in the information environment and whose narratives were prevailing. Successes and failures on both sides. They're differentiated by an environment. They're also differentiated by time frame, because one of the striking things about what we're facing now is the way in which Russia's long-term campaigns have been the most successful strategically, ones that were set in motion long before the war actually started. So, for example, playing out across the rest of the world, this idea of support for Russia and the cognitive dissonance for parts of, for example, sub-Saharan Africa that don't recognize that this is a war of colonial reconquest and instead still see Russia as an anti-colonial power. Or indeed Russia's long-standing campaign over a decade long of intimidating the West, primarily the United States and Germany, into not fully backing Ukraine for fear of consequences, described as escalation, which has now come to be synonymous with use of nuclear weapons by Russia. Those are enormous successes by Russia, which we have to offset against some of the operational successes by Ukraine and its backers. But the other important thing, of course, is future trends. And here is where, for example, that Tucker Carlson interview and how it is treated by Western media is indicative of where we're going to go on in the future. Because one of the determining factors of who is going to prevail in information confrontation from now on is this inability of Western media to learn from experience and not facilitate Russian campaigns. If you think back to the last couple of months, we've had first the New York Times, then Bloomberg, pushing these stories about Russia being ready for negotiations over Ukraine in order to, of course, attenuate the willingness to actually back Ukraine in continuing the fight. And look at the reaction by Western media to the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin. First of all, the media frenzy about it, boosting the messages, boosting Tucker Carlson's viewing figures. But then media outlets across the West, far too many of them searching for some way of making sense of what they had seen, seizing on the idea that Putin had used this to signal, again, readiness for negotiations with the West, which anybody who had to sit through the damn thing like I did would know perfectly well was very distant from what was actually happening. There's that, and of course, there's also the developing harnessing of AI capabilities to transform disinformation. Not just deepfakes, but entire influence campaigns that are automatically generated, removing the constraints of speed and scale from campaigns that we've seen up until now. That's going to have a transformative effect on the ways in which countries can reach into each other's information environments to carry out malign influence. And let's not forget, we have election seasons coming up across so much of the Western world. So things are going to change, and they may well change in Russia's favor.
Thank you, Kier. Those are excellent points also. And thank you also for alluding to the Tucker Carlson interview. And I don't think we should underestimate that. We always say this year is going to be decisive for Ukraine, but this year will be in light of, as you mentioned, the US elections. And so, Tucker Carlson obviously has a large audience among certain Americans, and already it is becoming more difficult in order to garner support for Ukraine in the US Congress. So, Ben, let's go back to you again. In his recent writings, General Zaluzhny has emphasized the significance of unmanned aerial vehicles and electronic warfare capabilities. What are your reflections on this prioritization for Ukraine's military strategy? Thank you, Ben.
First, let me say thanks to Kier for watching Tucker Carlson's interview so that I did not have to. Thank you, sir. Look, first of all, General Zaluzhny saved Ukraine. He was the right guy at the right time. The things he did, a very modern approach to distributed operations, personal courage, just feel for the battlefield. He got enough stuff in the right places in time to stop the Russians. And he was, of course, assisted by not only a courageous president who stayed in Kiev to help and rally his population, but also he had very good subordinate commanders, one of whom is now, by the way, General Syrski, who is now the new commander. So General Zaluzhny would have had 2 years of ups and downs, highs and lows, to understand what the battlefield is like. And of course, this famous economist piece that he wrote or that he produced laid out the challenge of fighting against Russians that have seemingly endless amounts of drones, how this has changed the character of war. You can't sneak up on anybody. I mean, all of us for the last 2 years have been watching endless amounts of drone strikes, blowing up vehicles, blowing up radar, blowing up artillery, et cetera, et cetera. And so what he's calling for is technological help. There's got to be a way, but there always is going to be a way. Since the first guy picked up a sword and the next guy picked up a shield, I mean, this has been the history of warfare. And so there's no doubt in my mind that there are a lot of really smart people, privately, commercially, and for governments that are working on counter UAV systems that are either kinetic or non-kinetic or some combination, as well as tactics that enable them to go after the source. Where are these things coming from? Where are they being launched? Well, this will eventually change. I mean, this will eventually get done, but this is something where the Russians deserve credit. I mean, they have gotten the advantage here, and we have got to help Ukraine address that particular problem. Same thing goes to electronic warfare. The Russians have always had better electronic warfare capabilities than us in the West. They invested in it, long range jamming and intercept, and we don't have the same quantity and quality in the West. And so this is another area where Ukraine is going to have to be able to counter that Russian capability.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, it's been a really interesting shift, to focus going from munitions to focusing more on technology and how technology could help Ukraine to win the war. At the same time, we also know that munitions matter, and there's an ongoing discussion on that. So I'd like to bring in Keir into this part of the discussion. Also, can you provide some insight into the military capabilities of Russia and Ukraine, particularly regarding firepower? I mentioned earlier that some military experts say that Ukraine is outgunned 5-1. So I'd be curious to hear what you make of that. Additionally, how might the EU's failure to deliver 1.1 million rounds of ammunition to Ukraine by next month influence the course of the war? Thank you.
Well, yes, you do hear constantly shifting estimates of the imbalance between what's being supplied to the front lines in Russia and in Ukraine as a result of what's coming from their various partners. And you hear anecdotal stories of just what the impact is of that on frontline operations in Ukraine. But the two key points here are that what we are seeing, just like I mentioned with the information piece, is we're now seeing the results of decisions that were taken long ago, a year or 2 years ago, in terms of what could be prepared in order to give to Ukraine, or in many cases, decisions that were not taken. The delay and the indecision and the foot dragging in terms of actually providing what was needed has direct consequences, because I think one of the things that is often missing from this conversation is that failure to act by Western partners, the failure of courage to actually do what is needed, has a direct and immediate impact in terms of Ukrainians dying. Meanwhile, that fixation on that static front line on the map has obscured quite a few Ukrainian successes that we've seen over the course of the last few years. That clearance of the Black Sea, removing the Russian Black Sea fleet from blocking Ukrainian trade routes that you referred to earlier, is in fact a major success, because it's not all about the position of the front line. It's also keeping Ukraine afloat as a country, keeping the state functioning, keeping the economy going, and actually being able to export again across the Black Sea. Black Sea is a major contributor to that. Plus, in the air, the fact that, as Ben Hodges mentioned earlier, there is air parity despite this apparent overwhelming superiority that was enjoyed by Russia at the start of the conflict. That is a major Ukrainian success. But it's the land campaign, of course, that's sustained most of all by foreign support. If you turn off the tap, as has now happened, you have direct consequences for the sustainability of the Ukrainian war effort. There are signs it may be turned on again, but is it actually too late? Because, of course, that takes time to feed through and bolster that Ukrainian resistance, putting them back in a position where they are not massively disadvantaged in terms of the munitions flows to keep combat operations going. If anybody doesn't follow the excellent Jack Watling of RUSI, I'd strongly recommend it. He has today put out a paper which charts the relative trajectories of Russian reconstitution of its forces ready for a new campaign and measures it against the possible capacity of Ukraine to resist. And that, of course, is not an encouraging picture. His conclusion, as he puts it, the sustaining Ukraine depends on the Western partners of Ukraine demonstrating a semblance of competence urgently before the end of this year. He says that's not impossible. I think that may be a little optimistic given past performance.
Thank you, Kier. And I'd be also, I mean, in context also, it's not as if nothing is coming through, but it's the question of, you know, is it enough? You know, France, for example, I read recently, will send 3,000 shells of ammunition to Ukraine per month by the end of January, compared to 1,000 2 years ago. So they've stepped it up, right? But there is also the question of whether it's enough. You know, that's not enough. That's less than what Ukraine fires on a daily basis, if I'm not mistaken. But I could be mistaken, Ben. You can jump in there anytime. But let's turn to you, Ben. If you would like to answer that, please feel free. But I would also like to ask you, with a variety of military hardware deliveries scheduled for Ukraine, ranging from Leopards to Boeing's ground-launched small diameter bombs, how might these acquisitions impact the battlefield dynamics? And what critical gaps remain, particularly in terms of air power? Thank you, Ben.
So at the beginning, I mentioned that I think 2024 is going to be the year of industrial competition. Both sides are trying to increase their defense procurements, ammunition production, maintenance, repair of equipment, delivery to the battlefield. Kier, of course, is correct. And what Jack, who does excellent work, I would endorse that. You know, they're trying to fix themselves for longer term. You know, it's interesting. I spoke to a senior Ukrainian officer the other day who told me that in the beginning he feared the VDV, the Russian airborne, more than anybody, but they're on their third set of people now. I mean, they may still have the same shoulder patch and cap badge, but it's none of the same tough old guys. They've been wiped out twice. So the Russians are having to reconstitute, and you can't do that overnight, not to a level of quality. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are trying to rebuild their own defense industry so they can produce things. You've got British, German, Turkish, and other countries are establishing business inside Ukraine now to help with production and with maintenance and so on. So it will be a race to see who can win this logistics competition. Maybe that's a different way to say it. I just saw that Norway and Finland have announced a new expansion of their ammunition production. And while the EU has fallen short of what it said was its goal, they didn't stop. I mean, there's still going to be ammunition getting produced. And by the end of the year, I actually think it'll be a better situation than what it is right now. What, of course, is so damaging and is, for me as an American, it's humiliating that the United States has failed thus far to deliver a new package. Now, I think there probably are some things that are still in the pipeline, but not a lot. And that obviously is going to dry up at some point. But still, when you put together despite our failure in the US, and I am not optimistic that the House is going to move forward with what the Senate just accomplished last night. Despite our failure, if you put together the combined economies of UK, Germany, Norway, Netherlands, France, Italy, on and on and on, it dwarfs Russia's economy. So this is about political will, not do we have the ability to make enough ammunition. I think that I don't believe that the Russians have the ability to knock out Ukraine this year. They have the ability to keep feeding a lot of people into the meat grinder, but even let's say they do finally capture Avdiivka, then what? I mean, you remember the thousands of people that were killed around Bakhmut. Then what? I mean, it's, capturing one of these destroyed cities, but there is no famous Red Army tank corps lurking in the forest, waiting to exploit it, even if they do capture Avdiivka. So I think General Syrskyi is going to spend this year stabilizing that front. There will be tactical gains and losses on both sides, but I don't see big movements. I see Ukraine doing what it can to buy time for next year, which I think could be the decisive year.
Ben, I agree with you. And this is a matter of politics. It's not just what's what we have potentially available is a lot more than what we're giving to Ukraine. And I always like to say to other NATO members to quote unquote spend like the Baltics. They've been spending close to 2% of their GDP that they commit to Ukraine. And if all NATO members do that, our support for Ukraine would be closer to about $500 billion US, which is a lot more than what we're giving to Ukraine right now. Kira, let's pick up on a point that Ben just mentioned. He briefly flirted with this issue of manpower and mobilization. What are the current manpower levels for both Russia and Ukraine? And what are your thoughts on mobilization efforts? And I should just also perhaps add that at least for Ukraine, maybe we should venture away from the term manpower since over 40,000 women now serve in the Ukrainian military. But thank you, Kira.
That's absolutely right. I mean, first on that point you just made, is Europe capable of defending itself against Russia? Absolutely yes, but it is a question of the political will to do so. And as so often west of Warsaw, that political will simply doesn't seem to be there. The challenge has not been recognized and the preparations are not being made. It is once again down to the frontline states to lead the way and show what is done. And that measure of 2% of GDP is, I think, by now well outdated because first of all, of the limitations of it that everybody was fully aware of, that it's a measure of input, not of output. In other words, it's a symbol of commitment rather than what you actually do with it. But also because so many countries have so much backfilling to do. They have to recover from 30 years of drawing down their military capacity. They have to put right first what is wrong before actually starting to build up. And look at the enormous sums of money that Poland is throwing at preparing its defenses as rapidly as possible and see just what it takes. Multiply that across the rest of Europe and the sums involved are very, very high indeed. In terms of the actual manpower, well, there's a good reason why the specific numbers are classified on both sides. You do see estimates of losses. You do see estimates of total numbers of men under arms. They are not fully reliable for a number of good reasons. Partly, of course, you have this comparison between an open democracy and a closed authoritarian system. Ukraine being an open society, some of the mobilization debate is playing out publicly, and some of the challenges that Ukraine is facing are actually open to public view. And of course, feeding into that, you have the point that Ukraine has to both feed its military machine for keeping people in the fight to defend itself. It also, again, has to keep its economy functioning. It has to keep the state functioning. It has to actually stay afloat as a country. And that, of course, is a drain on manpower as well. Meanwhile, in Russia, all of that is hidden, even from its own population. And the fact that it's hidden is actually quite a significant factor in, and this is one point where I'll diverge from what Ben said earlier, where Russia is still to everybody's astonishment, relatively successful in recruiting people to throw into the meat grinder, in part because of promising to throw money at the problem. Whether or not they actually get paid it in the end, the people who are being recruited from poor rural areas are being presented with life-changing amounts of money to actually go and serve in the front line, and that does draw people in. Plus, we see some astonishing numbers being quoted for foreign recruitment, for people being brought into the Russian war effort from countries like Nepal, the figure of 15,000 Nepalese being recruited into the system. Whether or not that's true, it does repeatedly happen that people from exotic countries are being captured by Ukrainians on the front line. What exactly that contributes to Russia's overall war effort and how useful these people can actually be if they don't even, in some cases, speak any Russian at all is another question. But there's no doubt that Russia is finding the fresh bodies to soak up Ukrainian bullets. All of this, of course, depends on these potential recruits not knowing a lot about what they're signing up for, not knowing what the conditions are. And it's also, of course, a question of how long that is sustainable, not only because of recruitment tailing off, but also because Russia is draining the sump of its manpower. How many more people can they actually spring from prison, throw into the front line, trawl from the rural areas, recruit from overseas, before it becomes even harder for them to fill those ranks?
Can I just ask also, in terms of Avdiivka is really in the news at present, and it is one of those meat grinder areas in many ways. I think last year at some point, some military analysts said that Russia lost something like 10 times more, soldiers on that front compared to Ukraine. Is that because Russia is able to mobilize so effectively, like you described, or is this a political area of contestation? To try and show a quick win ahead of the elections in Russia. How do you see that?
Well, those two things are not mutually exclusive. Now, whenever we have a situation like this with some major political event coming up, whether it's a speech by Putin or Russia's Victory Day on 9th of May, there's always this speculation that Russia's armed forces have been set the task of achieving something by that date in order that it can be shown off. That doesn't always, it's not always borne out by what happens after the fact. It's not always something that appears to come from Russia as opposed to from Western media speculation. But for the numbers of casualties that Russia is taking, rather than being a reflection of success in mobilization, it's more indicative of the fact that minimizing losses is simply not a criterion for success for Russia. And that is, again, one of the key differences between the two opposing sides that we have here. The value that is placed on the life of an individual that is in the front line, close to zero, it seems, on the Russian side, whereas Ukraine has an interest in protecting its people, looking after them, providing medical care where necessary, and, of course, minimizing the impact on society, which, again, is something that Russia simply does not do. It's just another indication of the way in which the front line in Ukraine is in some ways the dividing line between two very, very different societies from very different eras.
Thanks, Kira. And Ben, feel free to jump on this issue also. I mean, I would be interested, Ben, if you think that Ukraine is facing a little bit of a dilemma here also. It seems like there's a lot of pressure for Ukraine to do another mobilization drive, to help with rotation and so on. But at the same time, Ukraine is waiting for, this big military aid package from the US, and in the absence of, during this period of uncertainty, they just don't know whether they will be able to have the resources to train and equip those forces. How do you see it, Ben? You're on mute.
I don't agree with that formulation that you just laid out. Ukraine has plenty of people. This is not a shortage of people. They've probably got close to 2 million women and men, military age, that could be in uniform. The problem is that their personnel system is not set up or organized to generate trained units that are fully manned. They have one of the things that President Zelensky complained about when he looked at the last 2 years was that they had an inordinate a disparity between the number of people in rear areas and doing other things versus who was actually at the front. Now, there's always going to be a tooth to tail ratio that's part of modern warfare, but I think he points out that there is that we're not making the best use of the available women and men that are there, as well as a recruiting system that attracts women and men to want to serve. And I think most Ukrainians are certainly they know their country is under attack. So this is about defending their homeland, literally. But they also are not confident, perhaps, that they're going to be properly trained, organized, equipped, sent in, and put in a unit that then goes into operations when they're ready. And so you've got tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians that are here in Germany or Poland or Romania, and it's starting to wear out the patience of the host nations. Now, obviously, these nations are not and should not send them back. That'll never happen, certainly here in Germany, and it shouldn't happen. But these people should want to go back because of a sense of duty, but also because they would have confidence that they would be properly utilized. And if they were injured or killed, their family would be looked after, just the same way an American soldier or a British soldier, their families would be looked after. So this is a problem, and this is not something that the commander fixes. This is a political problem that the government has got to address to get enough people in uniform so that they can have units that can rotate, and you don't have the same guys sitting there for 1 or 2 years without relief.
Thank you, Ben. That actually answers a question also from Vijay Strau, one of the audience members who asked about potential Ukrainian conscripts living abroad. Ben, another question for you. What developments are occurring in the Black Sea and around Crimea, and what is their strategic significance? What measures could enhance Ukraine's position in those areas? I know you're very passionate about this.
First of all, Crimea, for me, I believe, is the decisive terrain of this war. I mean, that's what it's all about. The Russians don't give a damn about the northern part of Donetsk. Not really. It's all about control of Ukraine and so of Crimea. And I cannot imagine any Ukrainian government accepting a peaceful outcome where Russia retains Crimea. That Russia and Crimea continues to block access in and out of Azov Sea. So even if Mariupol and Berdyansk are finally liberated, they would never be able to rebuild as ports because the Russians would control access into Azov Sea. And so what the Russians are able to do from Crimea makes it very, very difficult for Ukraine to rebuild its economy and all the things associated with that. So I think the long-term strategic objective is, in order to win, includes the liberation of Crimea. And one of the necessary precursors for liberating it is to make it untenable for Russian forces. So long-range precision strike, drones, special forces, all the things that make it impossible for the Russian Navy and the Russian Air Force to continue operating from there. If Ukraine had ATACMS, for example, the 300-kilometer range ATACMS, or a lot more British-provided Storm Shadow, or if they had German Taurus, all of Russian-occupied Ukraine, every square meter would be within range, and no Russian air base or logistics hub or artillery piece or ship or maintenance facility would be safe. That's why it's so important, I think, that these kind of capabilities are provided to Crimea. Now, despite that, and despite our unwillingness to provide those capabilities, they still, with just 3 Storm Shadows, demonstrated or proved the concept of what precision strike can do against vulnerable targets like Sevastopol. And so I think the Ukrainians are going to continue. We know that they're working on their own long-range drones. that would be able to do some of these things. I think we'll start seeing more and more of those. But the last point I would make on this is that I think Ukraine has changed the character of naval warfare for all of us. They don't have a navy in the traditional sense, but yet they are defeating the very, very traditional Russian Black Sea Fleet. And I hope that the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, all of us are paying close attention to how they're doing that.
Indeed, Ben, Ukrainian innovation has been quite impressive in the Black Sea, especially how they have driven back the Black Sea fleet and open up some of those areas that makes commercial trading also possible. Kira, let's go back to another issue of support. Natalie Tocci was on one of our panels recently, and she said if you take the EU and the UK collectively, they've been providing Ukraine with as much ammunition as North Korea has been providing to Russia. Now, that said, how is the support of Iran and North Korea for Russia's, what is the importance of Iran and North Korea's support for Russia, having an impact on battlefield dynamics? Thank you.
Well, first of all, on the specific numbers, I'm always a little bit skeptical when people quote precise figures for what has gone into the war in Ukraine on either side, both on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side. I wonder about how specific you can be when quoting these numbers. You can observe trends, certainly, but when you look at the very accurate, supposedly, figures that have been quoted, I'm a little bit less confident that is really an accurate depiction of what's going on. But in a way, the underlying question is really, really simple. Both of these two warring sides have been shopping around the world through their backers for capabilities and munitions. The difference is that supplies to Ukraine are at risk of drying up and supplies to Russia aren't. And that's both drawing on their own stocks, drawing on the stocks of allied militaries, and actually purchasing around the world. The failure by Western Europe to revitalize and reinvest in its defense industry when it was time to do so means that pipeline is under threat. And even what was actually on hand and in stock within Western militaries is now seriously eroded. Ben just alluded to what could happen if the UK were to supply he said lots more Storm Shadows. The basic problem with that appears to be that there are not lots more Storm Shadows to provide, and who has placed the order to actually produce more of them. Meanwhile, of course, Iran and North Korea are reliable backers. They may not be, in the case of North Korea, providing the highest quality, but they provide the quantity. And Iranian drone manufacturing now being set up in Russia as well means that it's a steady pipeline. It means that unlike the US or the EU or the UK, the supply won't actually be interrupted to Russia. And if the supply is interrupted on the Ukrainian side for too long, it's that could be decisive.
Thank you, Kira. And noted also on how we have to be careful with figures, but I do mention those things also so that we have some discussion, some figures to work with also. But I'm glad you mentioned that. Ben, let's go back to you, and I want to ask you if you were tasked with devising a realistic plan in terms of budgetary considerations, in terms of time frame and necessary equipment, what does Ukraine need in order to achieve victory? And perhaps you can just maybe also start by what you mean by victory, because it seems there's a lot of different interpretations of what victory may mean. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, I don't think there's any confusion about victory. I mean, President Zelensky has made it very clear. It's all about reestablishing sovereignty and back to the 1991 borders. Russia ejected back to those 1991 borders, to which they had agreed several times in different ways. Now, that's the foundation of what a definition of victory would look like. But I would add that it would also include the 20,000 Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped and distributed around places inside Russia. Those have got to be accounted for and brought back. Accountability for war crimes. We know that there are tens of thousands of war crimes for which the ICC and other bodies have collected evidence that will be a part of the post-conflict process. And then, of course, some sort of security arrangement for Ukraine after this. Obviously, I think they ought to already be in NATO, but that's not going to happen, and it won't happen this summer at the NATO summit in Washington. So there's going to have to be something, because Russia will, even after they're defeated, depending on what happens inside in the Kremlin, they won't just go away. So I think this will be part of it. And then, of course, there is a reconstruction. I mean, not out of the goodness of our heart, but for practical reasons. You know, the world is suffering, and there are inflationary effects of what Russia has done to Ukraine, disrupting the flow of food, disrupting the flow of energy. This affects all of us, not to mention the 5 million Ukrainian refugees that are in Central and Eastern Europe. They have to have a place to which they can return. So that's what victory looks like. I think one of the biggest problems for us is that my president and the German Bundeskanzler, neither of them have actually said we want Ukraine to win. They use this, we're with you for as long as it takes, and even that's questionable now. So the failure of the leaders in the West to clearly identify the strategic objective is, that, to me, the single biggest shortcoming. What does Ukraine need? First of all, if I was in charge, I would hire Keir to be my strategic advisor for exactly how to go about running the campaign. They need the time to rebuild their personnel system. I keep going back to this, but you know, if you don't have the system that generates quality men and women that are fit and able to serve, then you eventually do lose this war of attrition. Capabilities that they need, there is no single weapon system or platform that changes it all. But long-range precision strike capability is, in my mind, the thing that would have the most effect on the battlefield. F-16s, probably we'll start seeing them early summer. The Ukrainians will be smart, I think, on how they employ them. The sky's not going to be full of F-16s that, like some video game, that all of a sudden start dominating. The Russians will be waiting for these things. And I think the Ukrainians will be very selective as they try to build up experience where they employ them to get the greatest effect.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. And Kira, I'd like to invite you to also comment on this question of a realistic plan, if you have some thoughts on that. I'm not a military expert, but I do read that there is this kind of 3-to-1 formula when it comes to offensive operations, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on that also. That Ukraine is going to still need a lot more support for us in order to win in a manner that Ben described. So perhaps I'd like to invite you to comment on these issues.
Well, I think it's worth stepping back even from that, because when you're talking about a plan being realistic, it has to be something that is not only in military terms something that will work, but also something that's achievable politically and economically as well. It's the budgetary issues. It's getting enough people on board to actually make it happen that is the challenge. In some ways, a much more complicated challenge than the military commander carrying out the task if he's provided with the means to do it. And that is where the Estonian plan comes in. One has been put forward by the Ministry of Defense of Estonia, a realistic means of actually funding and providing for what Ukraine needs to defend itself successfully through the course of this year, and then move forward to a solution that may end the war in the following year. They've calculated a commitment of 0.25% of GDP by a range of North European and North Atlantic partners would be sufficient to actually provide Ukraine with what it needs, given sufficient political will. And they contrast that, a means of staving off the enormous security threat to Europe that Russia poses at relatively little cost, compared to, for example, the enormous sums that were put into dealing with COVID or energy subsidies, dealing with the energy price crisis. And they say this is relatively small beer for dealing with a potentially far more existential problem. If people can sign up to that, then there is a realistic way forward. But of course, it brings us back to the question of what precisely is victory. And Ben listed some of the things that Ukraine, that would need to happen for Ukraine to feel that it had actually prevailed in this war. Interestingly, on the 10-point peace plan that Ukraine put forward in October 2022, only 2 of the points were actually about evicting the Russian invaders, restoring territorial sovereignty, and upholding the UN Charter. Everything else was what went with it. It was dealing with the long-term challenges because, sadly, just evicting Russia from Ukraine is not going to end the fighting. It's actually a change in Russian attitudes that's going to be required, a change in this confidence, first of all, that they can attack other countries to get their way, and second, that they will get away with it. It is only the long-term security guarantees and the guarantee to Russia that they will suffer catastrophic damage if they do it again that is actually going to keep Ukraine and Europe secure in the future.
Thank you, Keir. Those are some great points also, and also alluding to what Ben earlier said, you know, the time frame of what is realistic is also important, especially if you look at some of the Ukrainian troops that were trained last year. You know, it seems like there was barely enough time to train at a company level versus we're not even talking about a brigade level. But perhaps Ben would have some more thoughts on that. There's a question from one of our audience members, Steve Danner, who's asking, can you address the land campaign critical gaps? And he's referring to an article in the fall called Stormbreak. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But he's asking, are the right type of equipment and things going to Ukraine to breach Russian minefields and fortifications? Ben, thank you.
Yeah, Steve is one of the best engineers I know, and he's exactly right. The implication of his question, of course not. We have not provided the Ukrainians with adequate engineering equipment that can get through minefields, that can help soldiers get through all these dense obstacle belts. Of course, an important part of breaching is not just having the armored vehicles that are able to identify, detonate mines, and clear them out of the way. It's also being able to keep the enemy's artillery off your back. I mean, what the Russians were doing, even after the Ukrainians would laboriously clear a lane, then the Russians would use artillery to put scatterable mines back behind them. And so an important part of this is enough air power or artillery that can destroy the Russian artillery that's supporting the defenses. You know, I listened to General Kavoli Sakir back a while back talk about how you defeat Russian mass, and you do it with precision by destroying headquarters, artillery, and logistics. And so just as important as providing the necessary engineering equipment in quantity is also the precision strike or the ability to knock out the Russian artillery that is an essential part of their defenses. But we absolutely stopped well short of providing what they needed. And just by nature, engineering equipment is going to take a beating. I mean, it's in there. They're deliberately trying to detonate mines, for example. I mean, so you're going to lose some of these pieces of equipment, or they'll be damaged. And whether they're plows or rollers or the flails, you know, you have to have enough of these things to create enough lanes that are big enough to allow exploitation.
Thank you, Ben. Let's go back to Keir also. There's another question from one of our audience members, Nurulam Abbas, from his LSE IDEAS alumni. Well, he's saying that much has been said about U.S. self-deterrent by overestimating the Russian nuclear threat. He's not actually asking a question there, but maybe I'll ask you whether what are your observations on the Russian nuclear threats? Because it seems like earlier, you know, following the February escalation, there were quite a number of provocations by Russia that they would use, their nuclear weapons and so on. But it seems to have quieted down a little bit. So I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. And then Abbas also asked, will it be realistic to expect a Russian defeat in Crimea? I know Ben already talked about that, so I'd like to hear your perspective on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I'm very consciously on. We're hurtling towards time, and I know Ben has to depart on the hour. So I'll be super fast on the nuclear part, because this is something we've spent a great deal of time and energy researching, looking into the realism of Russian nuclear threats, as well as the effect that they have had on their target audience. And it's something that we have put out a comprehensive Chatham House study report paper on, which is publicly available, and perhaps, Leon, we can post that in the chat or with the recording afterwards. That will summarize all of the arguments much better than I can do in our remaining 2 minutes and 45 seconds. In terms of the Russian defeat in Crimea, well, Ben is very bullish, very optimistic, says it can be done. I'm cautious, but generally I agree, because the strategy that has been proposed multiple times for Crimea is not so much defeating in terms of overrunning, but simply making Crimea untenable. In order to make sure that Russia can't hold it, because it becomes unsustainable, and that through a process of degrading the links that actually supply and support Crimea, the Kerch Bridge, the ferry crossings, everything that actually makes it work, in order that Russia is effectively forced out under its own momentum.
Thank you, Keir. Ben, if you have another minute, I have one more question for you, and then we'll continue with Keir with another question. Ben, if you, what observations do you have of, what happened in 2023 in terms of Ukraine's offensive? We talked a little bit about some of those issues, but perhaps I should ask you, what lessons should we take from last year that we need to get right in 2024? Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, three things. First of all, we, the West, failed to deliver to Ukraine what they needed and what we had said we were going to do. We dicked around for months on whether or not to provide Abrams tanks and Leopards and those kinds of capabilities. Months. The F-16s, months were wasted. And so, Ukraine ended up having to do this, launch their counteroffensive in a way that we would never send a British soldier or an American soldier or a German soldier without having already achieved air superiority. That's shameful on our part. Now, the Ukrainians would not be without blame, of course. I mean, you could argue whether or not they tried to attack too many places, or did they put units in there that were not really ready and trained enough for brigade level operations. I think that's worth, of course, considering. What did we learn? We learned that even in the age of drones and satellites and high technology, you still have to have, when you're doing steel against steel, you need long-range precision artillery, you need a lot of ammunition, and you need the logistics and the people to be able to do all this. What's different, of course, is that you can't hide anymore. There's no way you can sneak up on somebody. It's all happening in broad daylight. I apologize, y'all, that I am having to drop, but what a privilege to be a part of your podcast, Leon, again. And I always love being alongside Kiergal. I always learn from him. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ben, also for joining us. We really appreciate your insight and all the time and effort that you put into helping us to understand this issue.
Thank you, Ben.
Keir, let me ask you, we have a question here from Graham Neville, who's asking, if Putin was to mercifully disappear, would any successor be likely to continue the conflict, or is this just Putin's folly alone? It's interesting he's asking that, because the title of your book is also Russia's War, not Putin's War. But I'd be interested to hear what you have to say on that.
Yeah, it's amusing you mentioned the book, because, of course, there are two parallel strands in books describing this conflict, and indeed Russia's broader war against the West. Some of them call it Russia's war, some of them call it Putin's war. I'm very firmly on the Russia's war side. There used to be long conversations that we had in policy seminars, and people would put the question is, do we have a Russia problem or a Putin problem? And I'm very convinced that it goes deeper than just one man at the head of this system, because Putin is not inventing all of the ideas that he's putting into action in his reconquest of Ukraine. Instead, he's just enacting them. There are broad masses of the Russian population that are fully in sympathy with conducting a genocidal war of colonial reconquest. And the way in which that pyramid of power at the top of the Russian system is all very much in sync, very much in sympathy, and is made up of people with similar backgrounds, educations, careers, and worldviews as Putin, suggests that absent some kind of inconceivable catastrophic upheaval in Russian politics, whoever comes next is going to be the same or worse, because Russia is currently on that rapidly accelerating downward slope towards totalitarianism at home and aggression abroad unconstrained that recurs so predictably throughout Russian history after they've had a brief period of attempted liberalization and realized that's a terrible mistake. This is something that, as you can tell, I could go on at great length, but the short answer is yes, just because Putin goes under a bus tomorrow, we shouldn't expect any change in Russian policy.
Thank you, Keir. And I noticed that there was some anti-war candidate who tried to, put himself forward for this election. Is that just trying to kind of test how Russians feel about this war, or what do you make of that?
Well, as ever, there are a lot of different explanations, possible explanations being put forward for what happened there, why somebody who was apparently standing in opposition to Putin was allowed to progress so far down the track towards actually registering as a candidate, whether this was a miscalculation by the Kremlin, whether it was actually a test, exactly as you say, to try and gauge sentiment. Either way, of course, in terms of an actual political initiative, it's going nowhere and will change nothing. It's just another symptom of how sometimes it is impossible to guess precisely what is behind specific things that happen in Russia.
Thank you, Keir. And then one final question, war-related, of course. Nurul Amin Abbas, again, from LSE IDEAS Alumni. He says there's a lot of expectations that long-range precision fire will make a meaningful impact to defeat Russians. However, there's little discussion on combat aviation, CIS, that surely will be required to successfully break through and regain territory. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this is another question that relates to the different phases of the war that we have been in. Just like Steve's question about Stormbreak, you'll have seen that there's been a kind of progression in terms of the focus on specific weapon systems that Ukraine is identifying as being essential to carrying the war to Russia, which have become fashionable and then faded from view. It's been main battle tanks, it's been long-range strike, it's been combat aircraft, etc., etc. And the utility of what they would need for breaching the defensive lines of Russia and following up with close air support, combat aviation, etc., is now possibly not so much to the forefront as the things which Ukraine is highlighting now in terms of prevailing and sustaining through 2024, and then moving to a more technologically based means of waging war. The UAVs, the electronic warfare, dealing with the phenomenon that Ben alluded to, that you can't do anything on the current battlefield without it being immediately detected by the enemy. That lies at the root of what Zaluzhny described as positional warfare. It got mistranslated or misinterpreted as stalemate towards the end of last year. The fact that you need a technological edge which is not currently present in order to break out of the current deadlock on the front line.
Thank you, Keir. No, I really appreciate your insights on this matter, and I'm a big fan of your work. We'll definitely share some of the links to your recent articles or books in the link when we post this to YouTube. I'd like to thank both of our guests, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges and Keir Giles, for your contributions to this very insightful discussion. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in. And last but not least, thank you to my colleagues, Dave Sutton, Dan Hurst, and Maria Branio for your behind-the-scenes support in making this possible. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you, Leon. Goodbye.